Welcome to Out with Dan, the podcast that spotlights and examines the voices of LGBTQ+ authors, characters, and our allies. Together, we lift our voices and we tell our stories. I'm Dan White. Join me as I chat with this week's author. Hello and welcome back to Out with Dan. Today I'm excited to talk to Mark Greaney about Midnight Black. Mark is a number one New York Times bestseller. Welcome, Mark.
Hi, thanks for having me, Dan.
Absolutely. So I do want to say right up front that I think that this book should come with a seat belt because you put us on a big time ride. Can you give the audience an overview of what Midnight Black is about?
Yeah, so this book is a standalone novel. You don't have to read any other books in the series, but it is the 14th book in my Gray Man series. And that series is all about a guy named Court Gentry, who's a former CIA paramilitary officer who becomes kind of a gun for hire with a moral code. And in this book, he finds out that the woman who he loves has been imprisoned in a Russian gulag, essentially a gulag, a penal colony in the middle of Russia, and he decides he's got to go in there and get her, and he's not really getting any support, so he kind of creates alliances with a group of older people, Cold War era resistance fighters, and some young Russian partisans Russian revolutionaries inside Moscow. And together they go in to try and get this woman out, but at the same time, the FSB, which is Russian military intelligence, has a very cunning colonel who has a plan to lure the gray man directly into a trap. So it's a big sort of Cold War era espionage in some ways, kind of a throwback to older novels, but it also has a lot of John Wick style action in it as well.
Well, it definitely has action in it. That's certainly the case because it is very propulsive throughout the whole book. It just keeps you turning page after page. And I love the fact that I saw in your bio that you've traveled to more than 30 countries. Have you been to this region in Russia?
Yeah, I've been to not the region where the penal colony is. That's about I think about a couple hundred miles southeast of Moscow, but I've spent a good amount of time in Moscow and up in St. Petersburg, where there's a little bit of the book takes place. And I went before the war when it was safe to do so, and but I still have hundreds of videos and pictures and all my recollections and notes and things like that. So I drew on that.
It makes it very interesting for this reader because I really felt the sense of place,
Good.
And that's important. Yeah, it is for me anyway. I mean, I like to feel like I'm right there with it, and I really did feel like that. And honestly, Court's love for Zoya is so deep, and you did such a lovely job with that, and the fact that we get some romance part, or at least this love interest, more than love interest. I mean, he's certainly on a mission. How important was that for you to sort of tie in love in this particular book?
Yeah, when I started this series, Court was written as a little bit antisocial because he kind of grew up into this line of work, and I didn't have love interests in earlier books. And so when I finally wanted to delve into that, I thought, let's do this the way that this character would do this, little uncoordinated in the ways of that, but he's completely fallen for this woman, and she has lived a life similar to his in many respects. She's a former Russian foreign intelligence officer, and just like Court, who has this fractured relationship with the CIA, the Russian foreign intelligence, the SFB, is definitely trying to kill her at different points, and now they've kidnapped her. So I really kind of wanted to show two people who are sort of thrown together, and it's very obvious that they would be almost codependent on one another. But in this book, Court really has all the motivation in the world, and maybe is more motivation in this book than any others before.
Well, and of course, Court wouldn't be dating the local librarian. That just really wouldn't work out so well that way.
Yeah,
so
maybe not.
Can you give the audience a sense or an idea of where the Gray Man came from? What was the initial impetus for creating this character?
Back in the 2000s, I had written a couple of books trying to be a published author and hadn't really got any traction with them. But I got in front of an agent with one of the books, and he really liked the writing, but he thought the plot was a little too ambitious for somebody who'd never been published. And he kind of said, if you write a book that, you write action so well. If you write a book where you could just put a guy on the cover with a gun, so sort of like a espionage type novel, he's like, I bet that would do well. And I had just recently been in Guatemala studying Spanish, and I'd gone down to El Salvador just by myself to do just for like a weekend. And I was just sitting in a bar in El Salvador, and I saw this American guy who was down there, who's very different from other people. And that was kind of the impetus. I just created this backstory while I was sitting there drinking a beer about this guy, that the reason he was down there was he was kind of hard edge looking guy. He's former CIA, but he's living off grid because the agency's trying to kill him. And it wasn't as a plot for a book. It was just, my little daydream. And then when this agent who I met kind of said that, I was like, okay, maybe I can play with this character, that there's a CIA guy and the agency's after him. Maybe he doesn't even know why they're after him, but that's not the point. The point is he's created this new life. And so I started that. I wrote a whole book, gave it to that agent. He said, no, thanks. And then I wrote another book, and he said, all right. And then that was The Gray Man. So that was my first published novel back in 2009.
Oh, wow. That's something else. Sometimes an agent says they want something else, you give it to them, and then they still say no.
Yeah.
It's a tough business. That's for sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you were the last writer to write with Tom Clancy while he was alive. How did that come about? I mean, was there a phone call one day from Tom or from your agent, or how did that come about to be?
Well, I was very, very lucky that the only publisher in New York who wanted to publish The Gray Man just happened to be Tom Clancy's publisher. So it worked out that way. And a couple of years after, my first Gray Man book came out, my agent called me up and said he'd spoken with my editor, and they were interested in maybe having me write the next Tom Clancy novel with Tom. And they asked how I felt about that. And it wasn't an immediate job offer. It was just sort of, they were gauging my interest, but I immediately wrote up something just to show them I knew all the characters. The first novel I ever read was Patriot Games, which was Tom Clancy's third book, I guess. So I was obsessed with the series, and my dad and I would give each other the Clancy books every year at Christmas. And so I wanted to show them that I knew who the players were and how they talked to each other and that sort of thing. So I wrote, I think, 50 pages as if I was writing in a Tom Clancy book. No beginning, no middle. It's just like a scene.
Right.
And then they had me fly up to Baltimore and meet Tom. And then that in 2011, we did our first book together. When we did our first book, I wasn't allowed, when I was out doing research, I wasn't allowed to say I was working with Tom Clancy because they wanted to see the finished product. So I was up at the Pentagon, and I was just going like, God, all these doors would open so much easier if I could just say Tom Clancy and I were writing a Jack Ryan book. But I was just, some guy there that had a couple paperback novels, but still I got pretty good access.
Oh, I love that. I love that. So I'm sure to write with Tom Clancy must be thrilling, but do you find it easier or more difficult to write with someone?
Well, I've done it a couple of times. I did it with Tom. I did some ghost writing early in my career where my name's not even on the book. And then I did it. I wrote a book that came out in 2019 called Red Metal that I co-authored with a Marine lieutenant colonel. So each one of those relationships was completely different. So there's really, people always ask me, how does that work? And I think and I have friends that co-author with Clive Cussler or take over the Vince Flynn series or whatever. And I think it's just different in every respect, but it's easier because it's fun for me. So much of what we do as writers is just sitting there all by yourself. And I feel like I'll have one conversation with my editor before I get going with a book. And then I just sort of mumble, non sequiturs to my wife about what I'm working on for several months. And I'll talk to my editor when I, get stuck on something, but he can't really see the big picture in my head, and I can't really see the big picture. So it's kind of nice when you're working with somebody to feel like you have this goal and you can bounce off of each other. When I wrote Red Metal with Rip, we came up with a 91 chapter outline because we were both going to write the book and go off and do our own thing. And it was very organized, and my brain doesn't usually work that way, but we kind of had to do it that way. And now I'm writing, when I write a book for myself now, I was like, why can't I go back to that time where I, put it all down on paper before I wrote it?
So does that mean you write organically?
I write too organically. It's not a virtue. In my case, it's not a virtue. I try to outline. I spent the book I'm working on now, which is the 15th Gray Man. I probably spent 2.5 months trying to come up with a really nice synopsis for it. And I just have bullet points, and they don't necessarily work together. And there's gaping holes you could fly a plane through. But I had enough to start, so I'm cooking along with it. But it's mostly organic. And I feel like my life would be better if I could get it all down on a sheet of graph paper and then just go back and implement it. But hats off to the people that can pull that off.
So now I'm going to ask a out of left field question. Do you personally dance?
Do I personally dance? No, I don't dance.
So there's a reason for that left field question, is because you choreograph your scenes so magnificently.
Thank you.
That when the characters move in a scene, it's almost as if it's ballet. It's so graceful.
Thank you.
Yeah, and that's, every time I talk to an organic writer who writes with such epic splendor, it's like, wowzer, because I just feel like maybe, you've got the outline, you go back and you fill in the little details and stuff. But this is so amazing. I mean, it's obvious that you have such an eye for detail on where people are standing in every scene. And it makes it so interesting to read because, as I said earlier, you really are right there with all of the characters. We're not on the outside. I feel like you put us right in the middle of the action.
Thank you. Well, I can say a couple of things about that. I want this story to be really, really kinetic and really have all those moving parts. But also, the most important thing to me as a writer, I think, is to be just completely focused and empathetic on the reader's experience. So if you understood where people were standing in the multi-levels of one scene or another, that's great. That's the best news I have, because I spend a lot of time going like, all right, am I explaining this well? Am I over explaining this? Is this too complicated? Is this three-dimensional space too disorganized? And I learned something in just a throwaway comment when I was helping the Russo brothers, who were the directors of the Gray Man film. I was out in Hollywood and I was talking to Joe Russo one day, and I was telling him how I wanted to try and write a screenplay one day. And he said, people want to go see these in the theater, and theaters have really big screens. So when you write it on the page, think about things moving up in the left corner, moving down in the right corner. And he's speaking almost metaphorically, but you understand what I'm saying. It's you want to just paint this picture and use the whole canvas for it. And so I think of that when I'm writing, even though I'm not writing screenplays. I want, in the reader's mind to be there's some sort of this big, at certain times in the book, not the whole book, but in certain times of the book, you want just discombobulating action, and but you have to keep it grounded enough to people know what the heck's going on.
When Court does something that I do, I have a bit of OCD and I count a lot. I'm very big on counting, and I see that he does that in some scenes as well, especially counting the number of people in a room, reading the room, and trying to figure out exactly what's going on. I think that if you ask the average police officer, they would say that most people's memory is not really that good. Yeah. They'll say, oh, Dan had on a striped shirt when it's obviously a floral shirt. And it's just because we see things. But that's something with Court. He is so detailed, and in a good way, because because of my OCD, it really spoke to me, because when I go in a room, I usually do look around to see who's there. And obviously, if you're going to be in an action scene, the writer has to show me the room and who's in the room. And so with your moving of Court around, I enjoyed that so very much.
Thank you. I'm always trying to show that this tradecraft that he's developed throughout his life, just to keep himself alive and to do his job, is very innate. So he does lots of little quirky things. I think you can overdo that, but I want to keep it to where it just feels real for the character, that he's very aware. He's clocking these people, and he's clocking this movement, and he's clocking the distance from here to here, and he's looking at a tank in the corner, and he's going, that's acetylene, that'll blow up, but my 9mm can't puncture it. So I have to come up with, there's always little things like that going on when you're in the action part of the scene. So it's a fun part to write about. And a lot of that comes in the rewriting, in the edits. And you go back in there and you go like, this seems a little thin, or, you've written something, but you haven't foreshadowed it. So I do my best work in the edits, and that's an example of that.
I love it. So I asked an author one time, who I will not call out their name, in her book, guns figured in very heavily in her book, and she had never fired a gun before. And I was a little caught off guard by that, because I really thought because it had figured so heavily in the plot that she would have at least shot something at some point. But I do realize that you have done quite a bit of training. Can you give the audience an idea of some of the things you've trained on?
Yeah, as far as firearms, I mean, even before I was published, I didn't grow up shooting. I wasn't in the military. I wasn't law enforcement. And I kind of realized that that was a gap. I did have a pistol when I was younger because my mom shot. My mom was like a Kansas farm girl and like an amazingly good shot. And so we would go to the range every now and then. But it wasn't until the 2000s when I was writing where I was like, I kind of need to know this stuff a lot better than I do. So I started taking a couple of firearms classes, and they got a little more sophisticated, and then they let me go into the next level. And sooner, or eventually I started taking longer, 5-day long sort of small unit military tactic courses and some battlefield medicine stuff. And I got in deep enough, and really I got to spend time with people in military and in law enforcement and SWAT teams and special forces guys and get to know that world. I do a lot of shooting now. I own a lot of the guns that are in the books, but I do some other stuff. I scuba dive. I got to fly in an F-18 jet, doing research. Wow. and all sorts of really cool things that I've gotten to do, but it all sort of makes the story a little bit better. I always say, the first few books you write, this is my Midnight Black is my 26th published novel. So wow. The first few books you write, you're picking the low hanging fruit off the tree. You have all these, you have a lifetime of ideas. And as you kind of expend them from one book to the next, you have to go out there and get new information and fresh stuff. So that's why, I do it the way I do it.
Well, and it's interesting. A coworker of mine bought a gun a few years ago, and he was showing it to me, and I was surprised at how very heavy it was. And it was one of those things that, on television, we see somebody just, pick up a gun and fire it. But if it's heavy, it's going to tilt. And if you don't know it's going to tilt on you, you're going to shoot somebody in the foot, which isn't really going to help you off so much probably. But I like the fact that I felt very comfortable that you knew what you were doing.
Yeah, there are lots of little quirky things about firearms that they get wrong because, like this author that you mentioned that hadn't shot, they might have a lot of detail about guns that they've gotten from movies or whatever. And a lot of it is cool, but a lot of it is wrong. And then so you see all the little things that people get wrong. And I hear from gun people all the time, that they appreciate the detail, but you also hear from gun people if you get anything wrong. I mean, they are the hardest. They are the hardest critics because it's not just that you got it wrong. It's that you're a liberal West Coast, whatever, and I'm like, well, I got it almost right. And
a snowflake. You're a snowflake.
It's like, I have that gun in 6.5. I don't have it in 308. So you're right. I was wrong, but I was using some information.
There you go. Yeah. Sometimes some people just really feel the need to say you got that wrong. So
yeah.
As far as I know, everything was right because I'm not a firearm expert. So,
yeah. Well, Jean Le Carré said a book doesn't have to be accurate; it has to be credible. So I kind of like that. I try and get the details right as much as I can. But at a certain point, you can bore the story. You can really drag the story down by going slavishly into the minutia of the details. I've done a lot of books where communications are important, radios and code names and call signs and all that sort of stuff. And at some point you're like, you just have to simplify this for the story because, you can't give this guy a call sign, a code name, his real name, his nickname, what his buddy calls him, all in the first 5 pages of the book. Right. That's reality, but reality can be kind of messy and you kind of have to dial that back.
So you've aged Court a little bit, which is nice because I'm a little older reader. So do you discover new things about him with each book? Is there a spicy food he can no longer eat? Is there something that as you're going through book number 15 now, is there something you learn about Court?
Yeah, I always want him to end up a book in a different place than he started, so that there is always this story arc within the book and a continual story arc in the series with him and his relationship with other characters. I mean, I've aged him a little, but I have not in any way aged him radically. I say that me and Court are both in our late 30s and we have been for like 15 years and
comfortably there.
And that's just a mechanics thing. Daniel Silva, who's honestly one of the best espionage writers in my opinion, that ever lived. He's aged his character, Gabriel Avon, very realistically. But for Court, I mean, people are going to want to see him, climb that barbed wire fence and get over and drop down on the other side. And, when I wrote my first Gray Man book, if my life depended on it, maybe I could have done that. Now I maybe could fall down on the other side, but I wouldn't get back up again. 10 years from now, I wouldn't be able to get up the fence. And so I don't want to be too slavish to, reality in that regard. So that, as we said, there's a lot of kinetic action that happens, and that requires somebody that can physically pull that off.
Yeah, I can tell you that I would have been exhausted and would have had to lay down and take several naps if I were Court. So
yeah.
Well, again, the book is called Midnight Black. Mark Greaney, this is so wonderful. Thank you. Do you have a website or social media you'd like to share with the audience?
Yeah. My website is my name, Mark Greaney, Greaney books, BOOKS .com. And then that has all the links to all my social, and I'm on all the social media platforms.
Whether we like it or not, right?
Whether we like it or not, exactly.
Wonderful. Thanks. Again, the book is Midnight Black. It's so wonderful. Thank you for joining me for this week's episode of Out with Dan. You can find more information about this podcast and its host at OutWithDan.com, on Twitter at OutWithDan, and on Instagram and Facebook at GoOutWithDan. This podcast is hosted by Authors on the Air Global Radio Network, and the theme music is provided by bensound.com. Join us again soon for the next episode of Out with Dan.